In this video, we'll set up the Yarn Spinner dialog tool, which presents the dialog scene in the game. To begin, we'll create an empty game object, which will act as the container for our Yarn Spinner components. There are three things we have to add: a dialog runner, a dialog UI manager, and a variable storage component. So we'll go game object, create empty, and we'll call this new object dialog. We'll click add component and we'll add a dialog runner. We'll leave this for now. We'll add two more: a dialog UI. It's actually called example dialog UI because Yarn Spinner is designed to allow you to have different kinds of interfaces. The one that comes with Yarn Spinner is good enough for our purposes here. So we'll use the example dialog UI. We'll click add component one more time, and we'll add the example variable storage. The example variable storage keeps all of the variables in your script in memory as opposed to storing them to disk. So it's really good for testing. You probably wouldn't want to use something as basic as this in a real game. You'd probably want to replace this with one that reads and writes to a file. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, so we'll use the example one instead. Let's begin setting up the example dialog UI component. There are a few things that are involved here. The dialog container is a game object that contains all of the dialogue-related UI elements. So if dialogue is happening, that is, if a character is talking to another character, then the dialogue container will become active and we'll be able to see stuff like the text of the dialogue, the buttons used for choosing your options, things like that. The line text is a text component that displays the current line of dialogue that's being shown. The continue prompt is a game object that appears after the current line of text is finished displaying. You can use this to display some kind of tap anywhere to continue label. Text speed contains the number of seconds in between each letter in a line of dialogue appearing. Option buttons is a list of button components. When Yarn Spinner needs to present options to the player, then these buttons in the option buttons list will be made available and update their contents. Finally, game controls container is a game object that contains all of the non-dialogue game controls. So if dialogue is happening, then the game controls container is disabled. This means that you won't be able to see or interact with the joystick while dialogue is happening. So we'll first of all set up the dialog UI component. Let's begin by creating a new canvas. So game object UI canvas. We'll call this one dialog canvas. We'll set the canvas scaler's scale mode to scale the screen size to make this a little easier for us to work with. We'll change the reference resolution to 320 by 480. We'll zoom out a bit so we can place our elements. Next, we'll create the dialog UI element container object. So we'll go game object, create empty child, and we'll call this one dialog container. We will make this object fill the entire space of the canvas by clicking on the anchors set up here, holding down the Option and the Shift keys, and that will cause it to, when we click, fill the entire canvas. Our line of dialogue should appear in the top half of the screen. So we'll make a new child. We'll make it fill the entire top row by holding down Option and Shift and clicking this item here, making sure that height is approximately 100. Now we'll add a background to this by clicking on Add Component and typing Image. We won't actually add an image to this, instead we'll just change the color by clicking on the color and changing the color to black and also the alpha to about 50%, halfway through, 127 out of the 255. Now we'll add another child object to this background. We'll go game object, create empty child. Again, we'll perform the trick of making it fill its parent, only now we'll inset it a bit by setting the left, the top, the right, and the bottom to 5, meaning that this object will be indented a little bit. Finally, we'll add the text component by clicking on Add Component and typing text. We'll add some text in here just to see how this looks. This is a sample line of text. Okay, that could be bigger, so I'll change the font size to double that, so 28. Bit big. Let's pick somewhere in between that. We'll pick 18. We'll now return to our dialog object and connect this text object, which we really should rename. So I'll press enter and rename that to dialog line. Go back to our dialog object and drag the dialog line object onto the line text. We'll also drag the dialog container onto the dialog container slot here as well. Next up, we'll add the continue prompt. The continue prompt is simply a text object that will appear in the right-hand corner of this container. So in the container, we'll make a new empty child. I'll rename it and call it continue prompt, and I'll place it filling. My mistake, it actually should be a child of this object, so we'll just drag that into the top half and then place it at the bottom. Next, we're going to just resize its height a bit, and we'll also go to the dialog line and resize that as well so that they don't overlap. So you notice when I select them both, they are not overlapping each other. I'll also indent this one by 5 on the left and 5 on the right, and then add a text component. I'll turn on best fit to make sure that it fits within here, and then I'll tap to continue. This is still a little bit too big, but that's fine because we can just resize the height a bit. There we go. And then I'll set the alignment of the text to right aligned. Now we can go back to our dialog object and drag the continue prompt into the continue prompt slot. Let's now set up our buttons. Our buttons will appear in the bottom half of the screen. Each one is just a simple button. So, adding in a new child of the dialog container, we'll call this one buttons container. While we're here, I'll also rename the top half, calling it line container. Then in buttons container, we'll make sure that that fills the bottom half of the screen. I'll resize that as well to make it fill up that last little bit. The buttons will be arranged in a vertical list. The best way to do that is to add a vertical layout group. This will make all of the child objects vertically aligned and take up the right amount of space. Let's now add a button by going GameObject, UI, button, and we'll drag the button so that it's a child of the buttons container. Notice how it gets resized to fill up the available space. And if I press Command D, they get resized. So make sure you have 4 buttons, and I'll rename them. So option 1, option 2, option 3, and option 4. Now, not all 4 options will be present at the same time. There might be cases where we only have 2 options. So if we were to disable them, notice how the buttons get resized. That's okay, I guess, but not the best. What we'd like to have is for them to all be the same height all the time, no matter how many buttons are visible. So what we'll do is we'll select all of the option buttons, and we'll add a layout element. This allows us to specify the minimum or preferred width and height of these elements. We want to specify that the preferred height of these items is what they are right now. So you have defaults to 28.37, and we'll leave that as is. Now we'll go to the buttons container and turn off child force expand height. Nothing will happen, but if we disable options 3 and 4, then the buttons do not change size. Last thing to do is we want our buttons to begin at the bottom and then move upwards. So going back to our buttons container, we'll change child alignment from upper left to lower left, and now they'll start at the bottom. Our options are now set up, so now we'll go to our dialog object and attach them to the options buttons here. The easiest way to add multiple objects to a list in Unity is to lock the inspector by clicking on the lock icon at the top right. Now, the inspector will not change when we click on other stuff. So if we change to show anything else, notice how the inspector is not changing. Now, I'll select all 4 option buttons and drag them onto the option buttons list. There we go. All done. Lastly, I'll drag the mobile single stick control onto the game controls container. Doing this means that the mobile single stick control canvas will be disabled when dialog is present. Let's test this by turning off Start Automatically on the dialog runner, because we have nothing to start running, so we would simply have a problem when it tried to start the node called start, and that would be a problem. So we'll just leave that for now. We'll make sure that Start Automatically is turned off and play the game. And there we go. All of our UI went away because we're not in-game. Our last bit of setup we'll tell the dialog runner about the variable storage component and the dialog UI component to use. So we'll drag our dialog UI onto the dialog UI slot, and our variable storage onto the variable storage slot. Run that again, and you notice there's no errors here. The dialog runner is not complaining about not knowing how to store its variables, and all is right with the world.